Okay, hello everyone. So we are here for our four-part series of discussion on The Elephant Vanishes by Haruki Murakami. And this is a collection of stories from the 1980s. And the collection itself actually came out in English first, and then the Japanese version followed afterwards. So we have the Japanese version here. So the theme of the whole series, we named it Man, Sex, Love in The Elephant Vanishes. And so we start from, so our first session today is the theme for the session is the encounter, as we will discuss how a man and a woman have an encounter. So the stories today that we're going to talk about are the Kangaroo, Communiqué, and On Seeing the 100% Perfect Girl One Beautiful April Morning. So these are the two stories that we're going to talk about, but obviously, we have other stories coming up for the next three sessions. So the way I am envisioning, this series is we kind of build on the previous session every time. So by the time we come together for the next session, we will have more to talk about because we will make a lot of connections between different stories, but also, in a way, Murakami is there's something unmistakable about his textuality. In other words, even when you are, reading different stories, you kind of see a certain kind of essence remaining constant. I mean, the word essence appears in today's story, at least one of them. So that's what I'm actually more, interested in, rather than single stories, but some kind of textual significance that we can kind of grasp over time. So that will be the kind of continuity from session to session, but also the connections between different stories. So today, the two stories, the Kangaroo, we'll just refer to them as the Kangaroo and the 100% Perfect Girl. Although actually the title of that second story in Japanese, it doesn't have the word perfect. It's 100% girl. So there's something about the girl being a 100% girl is in a sense as such perfect. But then of course there's the question of what does the girl mean, because as you know, it's he's looking at a woman who's 30 years old or something like that. It's not a girl. So the girl, it's a concept that we can kind of approach as we go on. Okay, so about the first story, I don't know, what did you think? What came up?
I was curious about the 36 steps, and I was wondering if it's about absurdity, because it's the reason he started recording that tape in the end was the family of the kangaroos, the 4 kangaroos, and then this lady. But he doesn't really explain the 36 steps. He said he could introduce logic to them by laying them out, but in the end he didn't. And I was wondering if it's about absurdity.
How is that about absurdity?
Because he seems very erratic in his writing. He's very it almost seems jumpy, but he's not. I feel like he has a lot to share. There's a lot of bottled up. I don't know if it's emotion, but
Are you talking about absurdity in the existential sense, existentialist, philosophical sense?
I'm not too familiar with it, but I was wondering if that's what it's about. He says there's 36 steps, but just because there are 36 steps, I was,
I mean, I think, to me, it felt like a representation of kind of maleness of thought, because I think the 36 steps really represent the kind of, in a way, it's really harebrained and all over the place, and yet it's still linear. And like I think that kind of I think that kind of describes the average male psyche rather well, especially someone who seems like as neurotic as the narrator in this in this particular story is. So it's like, because I found myself kind of reflecting on the way I make choices, and when you break them down, then yeah, it's just a bunch of random events that come together. It's like, okay, this choice. And I think a lot of men could relate to that if they really think about it.
So I mean, the expression of the 36 steps, that may be linear and, you know, a masculine form of thinking, we can say that, but what that expression captures may not be what the expression makes you think of, you know what I mean? So in the end, what does that mean? Like, it took these 36 steps for me to get to writing this letter to you. What is he really saying?
I thought it.
Yeah, I think he's trying to say like, it's very, like I really think through, like back and forth, or like there's a very huge or meaningful thing for me, and to write you this letter. So I was like, this is a very costly barrier for you to just write a letter to your customer, right?
Yeah.
And I think it was kind of like related to like the inability of direct expression of men, or like men are trying to give meanings to everything that they try, because they are rational, right? They are, or to say they are very conscious. They cannot be the men of action.
That's that's interesting, because what Jeremy is saying is actually, it sounds like it's the opposite, but they make a pair. They make a piece, because what it means is that, okay, you have this linear way of thinking, but that's precisely the reason why a man may not be able to express what he would like to. So you see the method or the form of thinking is exactly the obstacle of thinking. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's, I like that. But the point is that what he's really in the end saying is that, yes, there were 36 steps, but he's not saying that he knew those steps in advance. His point is that it took those steps for me to get to you, which means but then if one of them had been out of place, he says, I wouldn't have gotten to this point where I'm writing to you, which means it expresses something like contingency, which is the other side of what we call the absurd. You know, absurd means there's no pre-given meaning. Things happen kind of their own. You can calculate or predict in advance. So there's something about absurd or contingent that speaks to what we call fate in the end. Fate. What is fate in the end? It's some kind of contingency, and then you end up with the consequence. That's what we call fate. What do you think? Does that?
I thought, I was also like, my first thought was like, just like the contingent nature of their encounter.
Right, yeah.
Like the 36 steps, like, but I thought like, the 36 steps are also sort of like arbitrary, like whether it's like he like sees the kangaroo or sees like an anteater in the zoo, like the nature of it matters in terms of like its contingency, but like the fact of the matter, like when he like names these different like concepts in the story, like there's something about like the natural I forgot the name of it, like the natural impossibility.
Oh, imperfect.
The nobility of
imperfect.
imperfection.
Yeah.
Like all of these different like names that he sort of like just puts onto these like concepts that are like sort of like unknowable, but like he has to sort of name them and has to put them into like this box. I feel like it's similar to like this sort of like this arbitrariness of like these 36 steps.
Right. Yeah, I like that very much, because once again, the point is that it's only through arbitrary naming that you can do anything. In other words, for him to experience that impossibility of expression on account of the very method that he uses, this, linear steps, blah, blah, the very rational. But that's the only way he can get anywhere. So you see, it's both impossible, but then the possible is possible precisely when it goes through the impossible. I just want to make sure that you understand what I'm trying to say.
He's giving it a form. He's giving the impossible a form, making it hence possible.
We can say that, yeah. But he doesn't give. It's just that it happens that way. So there's something always kind of retroactive about meanings, right? You don't give an expression to something, knowing the meaning in advance. You just make an effort. You make a try, and then you end up with some kind of meaning. This is what I mean by retroactive. There's something retroactive about the meaning as such.
I mean, I think it like, this is also true for our second story today, but like, I think in the narrative, there's reflected a certain, like a male desire for fatalism, because men have the tendency of having to have a reason for action. I think that's something that really hinders the ability to find romance, because they need to justify it at every turn. And like, there's this sense of like, if you think you're losing out by doing something, or if this doesn't make sense, like you can't do it. And that's like really restrictive to something that we like, we consider like love or romance. And so like, both in the 100% Perfect Girl and in the Kangaroo Communiqué, it's like, why can't there just be something that forces me to like have a connection with someone? Like, because then I don't have to worry about like, considering all these reasons for like doing what I do in order to reach like a romantic connection with someone. It just happens to me and I have to do it. And like, the same with the guy who's like, oh, you're the 100% perfect girl for me. That's like, oh, the world decided that, so I just go through with it. I don't have to think about it. It's nice. And then for the Kangaroo Communiqué, all these things happened, but therefore I have to write this letter to you. So like, in terms of like complexity, they're complete opposites. It's like, oh wait, it just is, versus all these things happen, so I have to. But in the end, it's the same desire for like, I want the world to decide this for me, basically. Or I want to be able to say that me doing this, like, whatever logical gaps there are in my actions, it's just what the world decided.
What is the world in the first story, though?
Like, just the 36 steps, I think, because it's just everything arbitrary happening around him or occurring to his mind. It's just, that happened, because it really doesn't make sense for someone to go through 36 steps to write a letter. So like, it feels almost like it's a justification. It's just like, well, all these impossible things coincided together, and even if one of them didn't happen, I wouldn't be doing this. But because all of them happened, I have to do this. So that's why I'm writing this letter.
But doesn't it kind of make it look like what he's doing now, writing this letter to her, a very important, precisely for that reason? These things had to happen, delivering me to this point where I'm writing this letter, which means this is a contingent as such, kind of inimitable. It's a kind of faithful encounter with her, no?
Yeah, I think like that's kind of what I'm trying to get at, but like I'm focusing on like the man's psyche behind that.
So
like,
you're talking about why does he have to appeal to that kind of rhetoric
yeah,
in order to justify it? Why does he need to justify?
It feels like he's trying to prevent himself from backing out, or like this is just more comfortable for him to deal with psychologically.
So I mean, in a way, I guess men and women have to deal with different sets of expectations, and you're kind of saying that men have to deal with this requirement of kind of rational justification, especially when he wants to approach a woman, which is very bizarre, because if you think about it, that has nothing to do with seduction. Seduction is kind of you're kind of driven to encroach upon the person's space. That's what we call seduction. But what we are seeing here is like the other side of seduction. But the point is that when he talks about the reason why the absurd is actually a very important word, concept here is that he is struggling with the limits of language, right? So there are many parts where that idea comes up, but for instance, when he says, I sat down to write a response to you, as I always do, to customers who complain. So which means he has the safety of the discourse of his trade. He knows what he's supposed to do, and when he's ready to write her, he says, I drew blank. I didn't know what to write. So you kind of see first the discourse of customer service or whatever, the discourse of the trade, no longer serving him operative, but at another level, he's already talking about language. Language somehow insufficient. How he feels about that particular customer or the letter that he received exceeds the range of possibility that he's used to. So that limits of language, that's obviously a very foundational idea related to the absurd, existentialist understanding of the absurd. Yeah.
Because I was thinking, so after he describes what he finds so intriguing and enthralling about this letter, like for example her punctuation, her commas, and like what even is the point of the letter? Is it a complaint? Is it a confession? Is it a proclamation?
Yeah.
And then after that, he talks about sex, and I was wondering whether he's like not only inviting her to have sex in order to like build a connection, but also like to like rationalize her in a sense.
Rationalize her?
Yeah, because like this letter, because like language is failing, as seen with this letter, and then in one of your lessons you explained that sex also like lets you explore beyond language.
Yeah, so that's the thing. So there we need to be very precise here, because first the failing language is on his side. He doesn't know how to use language at the moment. I just wanted to take you to, if you have the book, it's on page 56. Maybe it's not the same. The pagination is not the same as mine.
If you read a line, I can search it up.
So it says, so enough of trying to write this all down. It's going nowhere. Say I write the word coincidence. What you read in the word coincidence could be utterly different, even opposite from what the very same word means to me. So you see how language is, he's taking issue with how language is insufficient as a means of even the object of communication, which of course we have to think about the title. It's Communiqué, which already kind of signals the fact that it's not communication. Communiqué is more one-directional, right? So the whole text is kind of, I think, implicitly at least, based on this idea that language is insufficient, right, or inadequate. So he says, this is unfair, if I may say. So here I am stripped to my underpants while you've only undone 3 buttons of your blouse. An unfair turn of events, if there ever was one. So he's complaining about language. He's like, okay, this is not going to work. And then what does he do after that? He says, hence I bought myself a cassette tape, having decided to directly record my letter to you, which means instead of giving up saying your language doesn't work, now he's kind of going a little bit more intimate. I'm gonna give you my voice instead of just words. As if, as someone whose job is really communication in letters, very, very standardized, letters, but he feels that regular kind of normative, context of language doesn't serve him in this context. That makes you think we are dealing with something like desire here. This is not everyday, use of language. But then again, so that's what he does. So that he instead of withdrawing from the impossibility of language, he actually changes the mode of communication, right? So he goes another step instead of retreating. That's what makes him a hero, if that makes sense, right? So, but then, so that's what he does, but on her side, her letter is not about communicating in our usual sense either. That's why he's so struck by it. The letter is, it has nothing that it wants to communicate. That's why he means, like, I don't see any complaint here, right?
Is that when you talked about failed communication? It's language without intent.
Failed communication.
Yes, when you
Is-
during the feminine writing class, you talked about failed
Did I
communication.
say that? No. I said failed communication is language without
intent, like
intent. Oh, I don't know what the context was though. Why am I saying
it was about this one girl. I think
that? You don't
the
have
one-
to name people.
the one who didn't bring up that she was a virgin because she didn't think it would matter really to him, but to him it was a really big deal.
Oh, you mean the girl like in a character?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Version. Which one was that?
And maybe the one with the Jack, where he went to war, or one of those stories like they decided to sleep with each other.
Oh yeah. Yes. It with the librarian. Yeah, right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So failed communication is language used without
Intent.
intent. Yeah, I guess that works. Yeah.
I'm lost now.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
where were we?
Because of the letter, because like he can't really
Oh,
decipher
there,
what
yeah,
the
'cause
what,
you're right,
what
right.
the intent of this letter is. Like what
Yeah.
it's a confession, a proclamation.
Right.
Is it a complaint, but not really
Right,
complaint?
Right. So in other words, I mean, communication, of course, we have to understand that we can't dismiss it just because it's impossible, but we still have to go through it to arrive at a certain understanding of the impossibility of communication. You can't get to the impossibility of communication without going through communication, right? It's the exact same idea that we talked about, how the masculine way of thinking, you know, this logical justification in order to, but without going through that, you don't realize that that's how you do and that's how you fail. Eric, does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So her letter is not only, I mean, that is really the centerpiece of this whole story, where he describes his reaction to the letter. I was going to save it for a little later, but I guess we're already there. So can we just think about that? If you have that, it's on page 59. So he says, basically his point is that I know nothing about you. I don't know, you know, what you look like, you know, but I have your letter. This is all I need. So in other words, we went from the impossibility of communication, you know, the inadequacy of language, to how the letter, which actually uses language, and yet it trumps everything else. So do you see the reversal here? Which means we're dealing with different ways of accessing language. So language as such is not some solid thing that can be either good or bad. What can be good or bad is how you relate to it. So his point is almost like the way you relate to language, because it's not just use of language either, because use is communal, right? It's a collective. But she already falls out of that collective kind of normativity of around language. So it's her relation to language is so extraordinary. So he says, your one letter gives me enough to go on. So, and then he says, your letter is basically your very essence. Although essence, I looked it up in the original. It's actually not essence. It's also translated into presence in other parts. The same word in Japanese, but it's translated into essence here. But in other places, presence. It's kind of existence. All those things. Although existence is a bit different, coming from the context of existentialism, is a little different. But in any case, but the point is that he says, you know, your choice of words, the handwriting, punctuation, spacing between lines, rhetoric, everything was perfect. Superlative, it was not, but perfect, yes. What does that mean? Superlative, it was not, but perfect, yes. How are they different?
I mean, like it was like I guess like to put it simply, it was perfect for him. Like it's not this like superlative,
Yeah,
like objectives or like best
yeah,
language being used, but like
yeah.
it's him that when like he relates to the letter, he sees its perfection, I guess. But like maybe like if someone else saw it, it wouldn't be perfect. It's kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah, I think that is there too, but I would like to take another step. It's more like, you know, what is perfect. Whether it's witnessed as such, whether anybody's appreciating it or not, it is, in a way, it's so. Today, you know, people use the word narcissism in a way that I really do not like. I mean, even Freud did that, so I can't really complain too much about it. But the point is, the perfect is, it means it has nothing excessive, nothing extra, nothing lacking. It's as is. It is what is meant to be. It's meant to be. In other words, it's not lacking or it's not overflowing. It's just kind of ideal form of narcissism, shall we say. But the point is, then does she need nobody? You know, she is a narcissistic person, therefore she doesn't need, you know, no. In a way, you know, to give whatever it is that you are as this, I don't know, self-contained sounds kind of selfish, but what I mean by self-contained here is that it's not demanding. It's not, you know, because our relations with the other, big, you know, big others, small others, they often manifest themselves as in the form of the demand. You know, when I talk to you, it's never just to express myself. No, me turning to you is already a form of demand. I'm demanding that you recognize me. Do you see what I mean? It was the AC, okay. So what I mean by narcissism here is precisely the absence of that demand. And in a way, he is explaining it by way of commenting on the content of the letter. I don't even know what you're doing. That's what he's saying. I don't even know what this message is really about, which means he can't place the demand dimension of the letter. So there's a certain coincidence between the form of the letter, where the punctuation's used, and also the content of the letter, where she's not really asking for anything. So it's a kind of perfect
Letter.
yeah, perfect letter.
So
Yeah.
But I guess like if we actually looked at it from the woman who actually writes the letter,
Right.
she is still demanding something by writing a letter and sending it.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think that's what he senses, at least. In other words, even when she's writing a letter that is obviously supposed to be for a demand, she cannot pull it off. Does that make sense? Even when she thinks she's doing it, somehow it comes out in a form that is not demanding. It's a dream woman.
I mean, there's something I really like about the main character, the narrator, being like working in, what is it? Like he basically faces complaints
Right,
all
yeah,
the time.
exactly.
And there's something about complaints where it's odd because we've inherently decided that, you know, customer complaints means they want something, but like in reality, like by itself, a complaint doesn't necessitate a demand. It's just I don't like the state of things. So it's not necessarily a demand for change. It's an
Right.
opinion more like. And yet, I think like the way the main character uses language, he almost loves language on its own. Like you can see this attitude in which he, like the Sandman story and like the kangaroo story, like he makes up language and he like finds joy in language and he finds it entertaining that he can just come up with things. Like I get the feeling, this might be a reach, but I get the feeling he doesn't like how he faces complaints and yet none of them are just complaints. And they're all demands, like you've said, like but now he's seeing something that's just like in the literal sense a complaint. It's telling a story about dissatisfaction, but I don't want anything from it, but I don't like this. And he looks at it and he's like, this is a complaint. This is the first proper complaint I received.
Right, yeah.
And like that's what makes him fall in love with
Yes.
it. And like, you know, he even goes on to say it excites him sexually. And I think that's the reason why, like, he loves language and he's dissatisfied with, you know, complaint being misconstrued as something else. And now that he's seen someone who's finally encapsulated the essence of a complaint, he loves her.
Exactly. So everything you said is summarized in this one sentence where he says, well, the long and the short of it is that there's no you in the whole piece of writing. Do you see what I mean? So that when, you know, of course we are surrounded by the discourse of how you have to, you know, it has to be about you know, you have to be this. That you know, having me is, in a way, it's so burdensome. You know, have this idea that I am this, you know, but that kind of explains why many people are unhappy today, because it's that pressure to have me. And what he's saying is that this letter does not have her, as that her would be the demanding presence, right? The demanding weight of the letter. Not to use the word presence because he uses it in a very positive sense. So let's say there's a certain kind of weight to the letter when there's the person. Does that make sense? Yeah. So so that's where I think you're exactly right. That's where he is like excited at multiple levels. You know, there's another person who can actually use in the proper sense language rather than become the language that they speak, which is it's kind of related to this idea that, you know, we want different names for every little thing, because the names that we have are not adequate, not that we can ever get to the 100% adequacy of any term. So anyway, so that's I think that's great. So I guess that from there we have to, I think that was more to your question. So how do we go from there to I want to sleep with you?
Oh yeah, because like on my notes I was thinking about like the different purposes that sex can serve.
Yeah.
I thought it can be a release, and then you also mentioned sex as a gift. And I thought sex can also be a claim, but also like a way of bonding and creating something social with another subject.
Right.
And I thought that's like the fourth point was that's what he was suggesting. But then he also said like he doesn't want to impose on anyone. So like whether he sleeps with her or not, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah. In a way, that's a tricky, I think, point in the text. Because at first he says, I don't need to sleep with you, but then let me think about it, you know.
Yeah.
But then later on he actually says that I am not saying that I want to sleep with you as a woman. Did you get that part? Because that's where it kind of becomes a bit confusing. So
I might turn the AC back on. I think it turned off.
oh yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, I guess it's the last page. He says, there's just one thing I'd like to get clear though, which is that I do not lust after you sexually as a woman. like I told you, I'm angry at the fact that I'm only myself and nothing else, blah, blah, blah. So the point is that he desires her sexually in the previous page, and then now he's saying that I do not lust after you sexually as a woman. So, I know how to make sense of that, apparent shift. Yeah.
I mean, to me, it felt like he's trying to emulate the letter that he got from the woman, because he doesn't want to make his intentions clear, because that's what he loved about the letter he received. It's like, I don't get what you're trying to tell me. So he's trying to do the exact same thing, it almost feels like. And like, that's his way of giving a proper response to the letter that he holds in such high regard. So that's why, like, even if it seems back and forth, there's a clear logic to it in which he's skirting around, asking something of the recipient, or like even expressing like a direct desire. And like, I think that's the way in which you don't get the text itself while reading as a reader, I think makes like, it's what makes sense because of the contents and like what the narrator is expressing to us.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that these are two, contradictory ideas. I mean, I think we can definitely identify a continuity, or how they're actually saying the same thing. Meaning, when he first says that, I want to sleep with you, but I don't have to. But then, I take it back. And at the end, when he says, I don't lust for you as a woman. So something happens in between. So we'll have to clarify that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the 6 here is just a representative of the distance between him and the woman, right? To say there's like 3 levels of distance. One's letter, one's recording, and the other one is like sexual interclosure. And the 6 here, it's like it's absurd in a way that he's not aiming for any pleasure, right? Because he's just aiming for the closest distance that he can get with the other soul that he appreciates, right? Because they both have those the purity, right? It's like what he says, like a dead body, like in the middle of nowhere, like the picture of.
Right. Yeah. That's where I was going to go. But that's related to I think also what Moritz was saying about you had several definitions of.
I was like, so I often think about this a lot, like the different ways men have sex. Like once as a release, just to get rid of the tension, and then as a gift, the one that you also mentioned, and that kind of reminded me of semen retention as like a literal literal gift, and then also like the claim. And then also like there's like this bond, like the social aspect to sex, where like it just brings you closer, like as in sense like as.
But did you mention the gift? I didn't catch that.
No.
I think.
Oh no, that was like during the middle of the semester when we were talking about this other story where you were like in the end it's like, should I have slept with her?
Oh yeah, we're gonna talk about it next session.
Yeah, I know.
So
But like
that's,
you brought up that like sex is also a gift.
Yeah.
Oh.
I mean, I actually taught it that way many times. I don't know. Maybe we kind of agreed. I don't remember. But in any case, that's why the second session is titled "Man's Gift." So we'll come back to that. But here, what's interesting is before he gets to his explanation of why the letter is sexually exciting, he goes through this bloody image of a massacre, right? So I don't know if you guys, were able to make sense of that. So he says, your letter reminded me of a news photo from the scene of a massacre, with no commentary, no article, no nothing, just a photo. A shot of dead bodies littering some roadside in some country somewhere. Bang, 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 there's your massacre.
It reminded me of like when your cat brings home a dead mouse as a gift.
A cat does that, yeah?
I mean, it's like
what does that?
No, but like, I know it's just a cat, but like it's like like you get like someone brings you gets you something, but you just don't really know what to do with it. It's like maybe in like one of the stories where when we read Freud, where like the kid leaves a gift for the parent in the toilet.
Yeah, I mean, basically, for children, their own, feces can be a form of your memory must be fresh now.
Where like the deposit in the toilet would
Yeah.
be left as a present for the gift for the parent.
I mean,
Like it's the child's gift.
no,
Yeah.
leaving it behind. That was Freud's example of a criminal, like a serial killer or some criminal would mark his presence with his feces as a form of. It's also there's a gift there, it's something of himself. Yes, but here, I think the massacre, that insertion here has more to do perhaps with kind of an existential.
So I think what he gives the image here is like it's untouchable.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Right,
like
yeah,
so
yeah.
pure
Yeah.
that it's untouchable. I don't want to measure about like I don't want to compare it to Jesus,
Yeah.
but it's kind of like the same, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's too perfect to be touched,
Mm.
and it's so to say inhuman, right?
Good.
I mean,
Yes.
I'm only really good at like very shallow analysis, but like to me it feels like the connotations of a massacre and the connotations of a complaint are both the assumption that they will be negative. And like the same as with the complaint letter and with the photo of a massacre, in being it, you assume that it has a negative connotation, and yet without any context, you can't safely assume the intention. Like what is this letter of complaint
Yes.
without some kind of demand? Like what does it want? And what is this photo of a massacre without context? Like it feels the same. It has like the same energy to it.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Jeremy would not be familiar with this, but you guys were in the same class, so that's.
But I'm not really sure if I understand. Like, what do you mean about it's so perfect, so pure, kind of like Jesus, and then the massacre?
Oh, so basically that is too perfect. So it's very. Did he take the?
So
Communiqué?
No.
So basically, to be a human, right? You need to have, to say, the conscious and the move. It's not. It's like for me, I'm trying to understand it as a skill. Like you have to at some point, like 99% of God, like what's that word? Consciousness, and or like 1% of like I don't know like the rest. But Jesus or this figure was able to have like 100% of consciousness and 100% of the rest, whatever you need. So it's like inhuman. It's like not.
Yeah.
So-
Inhuman because it's not supported by any discourse. So that's where the purity that Jeremy is talking about. Purity means, so to go back to what I wanted to, the concept that I wanted to bring up for the three of you at least is the real. It's a piece of the real, which has no support of the symbolic discourse, which of course makes sense of it so that we can live with it, but then it also, in a way, it pollutes it. The real is just like the massacre scene as such, because it's so outside any kind of our system of explanation. It has that weird purity. So I see what Jeremy is getting at. So in a way, it's only going through that kind of 0 point where all discursive defenses have completely stripped. When you go through that, you come out of sexual attraction. Or sexual attraction means it kind of takes you through that point of nothingness, right? But nothingness doesn't mean there's nothing. It's more the nothingness of, the no defense, no effects of discourse. So you no longer talk about, oh yeah, I felt this actually appears in one of Murakami's other stories, like, oh, doesn't it mean like he should feel sexual desire for me? A girl, complains that the boy is not interested in approaching her sexually, and she complains like, why is it that he does not have sexual desire for me? That sexual desire is entirely discursive. She has this expectation that he has to have sexual desire. But here is sexual desire that is almost completely brought down to the level of the body, which is neither beautiful nor romantic. It is just what it is, right?
Yeah, that's how I understood, like, how does a letter excite someone sexually? I felt it was just like, it's just energy, like physical energy, and the way physical energy expressed itself is, sexual, like, excitement. Like, cause like that's like kind of the end point of like material energy, I think, when it comes to biological beings. So like that's what it felt like to me, because it's such an unknown energy, and like it's undescribable, like why this thing excites me. And so that energy reaches like the final destination of energy, and that's just sexual excitement.
Right, yeah. So here what we need to be careful is not to posit anything like the real as such. Then that would give rise to some kind of pure sexual attraction. It's more, that's why the letter is important. The fact that the real is defended by way of discourse has to be marked as such. So in other words, her letter, by withdrawing from the usual functions of language, her letter is the gesture of that withdrawal. So it's through that gesture she makes it visible. So without that withdrawal, you don't really get to experience that real purity, the thing that is not defended by language, or you have to use language in order to mark that withdrawal. Then you see that real in that passing moment. You can't dwell in the real, permanently. You can't. It's an experience. Yeah.
Also, I think the character being a man who reads letters all day,
Right.
it's a perfect character to show how pure this letter is.
Yeah.
Because as a man, as in this job or in this position, he's very good at extracting information from words, right? So that metaphysical process is keep processing in him all the time, and just one of a sudden he saw a letter that he gets nothing out of it,
Right.
and that's just, well, for me, it's, yeah, it is pretty sexy in a way, but it also throws some kind of like absurd towards him, right? Because suddenly, like, this letter means nothing to him. It's like very extreme. Like, it's either this letter, like, as you said, if he goes through the process of extracting information, it's either nothing or the whole letter, right? So I think that's the part of him saying that it was like a sexual excitement, because it was such a pure and simple and straightforward thing,
Yeah.
right? It almost feels like a physical body, like body-to-body strike, instead of like information delivered
Right.
through language.
Yeah. So it's not the so I completely agree with everything that you said. So to put it in my words a little bit here, the body is not there, and then you can just separate, get rid of language, and then you have the body. No, the body is experienced precisely in the moment when language is withdrawn. So in other words, when language kind of fails, in that failure you experience the body. So where do we see that in the letter? Because what he notices in that letter is too many punctuation marks. And later on, he says what he wants on page 62. So this goes with that punctuation marks that he talks about. He says, okay, let's put it this way. I would like to sleep with you, but it's all right if I don't sleep with you. What I'm saying is I like to be as fair as possible. I don't want to force anything on anybody any more than I want anything forced on me. It's enough that I feel your presence or see your commas swirling around me.
The important thing that's striking is like it's the comma swirling around, not even any of her words, none of her language, just like the commas in between separating the words, sentences.
So for him, obviously commas are part of language. Commas are not language.
But
They
like
are
the,
language.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, they are they have the interesting status where they're part of the language and yet they are other to language. Because commas mean what? You pause. Words are not filling the space. Commas mark that absence. So that's what I mean by withdrawal of language. That's where you actually sense what is not language or what is not the usual, sense of language. There's this other dimension of language, the bodily dimension, if you want to call that. So the commas are very important to him because what he's saying is that I feel your presence precisely when absence is marked. And the commas mark the absence. So the presence that come out of that markers of absence is not the kind of identity type of presence. It's a whole other kind of presence. And it's that presence that is sexually exciting.
Like she uses commas excessively,
Yeah.
which like the reason that we said that the letter is so perfect for him is because there's no excessiveness
Mm-hmm.
to it.
Right.
But like in using the commas excessively, like to mark,
Yeah.
it's like a gap in the language.
Right. Yeah. So it's more like the excess of her letter is the excess of withdrawal rather than putting yourself forward.
So is it like the object petite?
Objet petita, your favorite. Objet petita, this Lacanian term. It's not the comma itself is
Yeah.
the thing, but it is the body of objet petita. Because objet petita is not a thing. It doesn't exist. But something comes along to kind of give it body so that it can be felt, it can be experienced, right? So for him, the objet petita in this relationship with her is the comma. I mean, to kind of summarize what we've been saying.
What is it?
It's very, you need to take another course with me then.
I still don't understand it. I
Or-
took the course.
Or actually, Moritz loves to talk about it in every class, so you should explain
It's
it.
really
Not-
fascinating.
Yeah, but not right now, because that will take hours.
I mean,
I'll take the course.
the concept of the comma as like a negative space of like existence, I guess, or like expressed existence kind of makes sense. When you read like immediately following that, he writes about how like, or I guess he speaks about in this part, about how like he starts breaking down because he's breaking down everything around him into like these separate things that he has to comprehend, and it makes him want to jump out of the train, basically. And
Right.
so it feels like because he's so in tune with language, and like we've already seen that he's very good at using language to the point where he can come up with his own language. He's so in tune with language that what is manageable to normal people is in excess of like the symbolic world to him, because he's so in tune with language, everything is too much. Like even the same amount of something, the same amount of symbols is too much meaning for him to deal with. So he's feeling this anxiety and he just wants to get off the train, which I think could serve as a metaphor for just like escaping like the symbolic world. Like
Right, yeah. But we can say exactly the same thing in reverse. Meaning, it's not that because he's so sensitive, he's so good at language, everything is too much. We can actually say that even if it's just a small thing, like when he says, oh, looks like we were talking about receding hairline.
Oh my
I'm
God.
sorry.
Which page?
62 of the bottom of the page. So he's on the subway and he's thinking, looks like that businessman's hairline is receding, or the girl over there has got such hairy legs. I bet she shaves at least once a week. Blah blah blah. Little things like that, like little things, and then until finally you've got the shakes and you want to jump out of the car then and there. Meaning what? It's just, this is existentialism, the kind of absurd that we're talking about. It's like, why? Why this girl with such hairy legs? What is that? So in a way, it doesn't take a lot of talent with language or intelligence. If you just pause and really look, everything is ready to throw you into madness. Don't you think? I mean, so that's, I think, what he's saying. It's almost like, but it's possible that he didn't really notice that he has these experiences until this encounter with this letter. It's possible. Just like in The Fall by Camus, he lives through his life as if he believes that he forgets everything. And then there comes the fall. He kind of falls from the grace of the universe, and then he begins to remember things that he was sure that he had completely forgotten. So in a way, the consciousness is obviously the other side of the absurd. You experience the absurd precisely because you have consciousness. So here he is having a kind of, to me it's a very existentialist setup.
Oh, so this is like, this letter is also like a key for him to see, like, or to be conscious, right?
It's kind of like the lady on the bridge in The Fall. Yeah.
Oh, I see. So
Yeah.
before he was like just extracting information, responding, extracting like everything, and just all of a sudden he just suddenly like, oh, so that's why he become like, how do you say? What's the word? Wait, what's the word? Binary? What's that word? I
Binary?
No, like two-sided.
Bipolar?
No.
Duplicitous.
Duplicitous. Yeah.
Yes.
That's why he became like a bit duplicity when he says he want to have sex with her, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he's like,
okay, we can say that too,
he's like back and forth, and he also cannot. He just, I feel like he just cannot stand the point that I want to have sex with you because it's for joy. No, he wants the process, right? But he doesn't want to end. So it's if for me, it's just feel like he just want the process. The beginning is already happened, but the end, it doesn't matter. He doesn't want to end. He tries to avoid it. So that's why he cannot, or he cannot make decision. Or we can even see that he gave the right of making decision to the woman.
Her, yeah. I think that is valid. Yes, that is valid because that also is related to the number 2 that he talks about.
Yes.
He says his complaint is what? His complaint is against existence. He says, my only wish is to be in one place and another place at the same time. But he doesn't say, I want to be in multiple places. To me, this is very interesting because in our world, we love plurality. Plurality means it has to be more than 3, at least 3 and more than 3. But here, he insists on 2. And then he says, perhaps, if I split into two and you split into two, then maybe the four of us can be in bed together. But always the starting point is two. So yeah, so my question was, what did you make anything of that insistence on number two?
I mean, it's probably irrelevant, but like because I read Symposium recently for a course.
Oh yeah.
What it reminded me of was I don't know if it was Phaedrus, but like the before we were two Aristophanes,
Yeah.
the monster
Mm.
with like two sides, and then we were split, and then we were supposed to find each other within the other half.
Yeah.
Like that's the only thing that kind of popped up in me.
Yeah. So, but the point is that that's definitely. I was also thinking of that too. But to remain in our kind of cultural space, because we live in a culture where we think the more the better, which means like if you have, if it's possible, people would actually want each individual with his or her own gender. I guess his or her doesn't work in that case, right? Whatever it is, it's gonna be your own gender. But in a way, he insists, Murakami, I think, throughout his texts, although there are, yes, it has nothing to do with, to insist on number two, insist on two, or the binary, has nothing to do with rejecting less normative forms of sexuality. No, even in non-normative sexual relations, the two still operates. So it's not about rejecting, like with Freud, when he talks about, when he calls this homosexuality a form of perversion, there's no moral judgment. It simply means that it's not the normative sexuality. That's all. But the point is that that too kind of, to me at least, it reveals what matters to what gives orientation to his entire textuality, which is sexual difference. Masculine, feminine, and so in a way, when he says, I'm extremely dissatisfied because I can't be in one place and in another place, yes, literally it has that significance, literal significance. Why can't you live in, take courses here and smoke whatever in I don't know in Berlin, I don't know. but the point is that there's that literal sense, but it's almost like, what does it mean that I am a man, right? And I'll never know what it is to be a woman. But then it's only from that impossibility you can have something like sexual desire that he's experiencing. So it's both, once again, it's both the impossibility that is precisely the condition of what is more than possible. What is not just possible, but what is more than possible. This ecstasy of this desire that he's experiencing.
So I guess if his wish did come true, like if he really was at two places at once, he would be extremely unhappy.
First of all, he wouldn't exist. Right? It's not. And that idea of being in one place and another place at the same time, that's gonna come back in barn burning. The guy with this.
So I'm not sure if I understand Winnegar correctly, but I love his identification of.
He's going off in another direction.
No, it's like to say, I love the identification of sex. So to say, if there is two sexualities in the world, 6A and 6B, right? We call it A and B. And if I'm a man, and if I'm a pure man, to say, I'm 100% A. And if I'm a pure woman, and I'm 100% B, right? But in this world, nobody is 100%. Like, now like we have to be somewhere in the middle, right? For example, I am like 75% man and 25% female, and then it makes me a man, right? It gives me like masculinity because my masculinity overdrives the character of females, right? That small portion is what makes you man. And here, I think what he was saying is that same to what he mentioned before the discussion, that there are two extremes, like two types of men that are discussing the social media right now. One is very masculine, and the other was like kind of like neutral, right? It's not like girl-ish, but I would call it neutral. It's like 50-50. So I think what he was trying to do here is like he's trying to be. So my first interpretation of it was like he's trying to be pure as a man or as a woman, right? If it has to be like specifically two, and the other one is that I don't know. I think he's very focused on the process of everything. He never mentioned about I just want to be here and be there and be here and be there. He never talks about why does he want to do so, or like what is the purpose of it.
Yeah, so that once again it takes us back to existentialist idea of the absurd, because you can't be in two places at the same time. But if you think about it, why am I confined to this restriction of existence? So there's that. But then what he does beyond that kind of existential questioning is to position sexuality as a form of both suffering from that in a very immediate way, but also a kind of solution, a kind of redemption of that existential condition in which we have to live. Sexuality brings in a kind of the difference within. It's not a difference without. It's like it's not an alternative, but it's to do that limit differently, and that doing differently is what sexuality, the gift of sexuality. I don't know, Alex, are you?
Yeah, I was thinking in like a completely different direction when he mentioned he wanted to be two. I like my reading, like listening to this, it makes more sense because like there's like the explicit mention of sexuality along with his desire to be split in two. But like to me, my first impressions of reading it, it's like he seems to be having trouble with like the abstraction of the world around him. And abstraction is inherently difficult or impossible if you're one, because everything you do is inherently subjective, because it's, you know, you're the only judge of anything. Like when it comes to perception or like, you know, judgment or thought, it's inherently subjective. But if you're two, abstraction suddenly becomes possible,
Right.
because you have an anchor. So it's like, instead of floating in this like world of subjectivity, suddenly you now have 2 points and you can draw a line, and like regardless of wherever two different points are, like there's always a single line you can draw between them, hence the abstraction becomes possible. So he can feel a lot safer or like a lot more stable than he is now, or like at least that's what he thinks. Like that was the first impression I had when reading, like why does he want to be in two? Like what is the significance of two?
So in a way, I mean, yeah, yes, yeah, go ahead.
Because that what actually brought me to, because I was writing an essay on the phallic and the other jouissance, and that the phallic jouissance is limited by this object-subject relationship. But then if there's two, as you said, like you're able to enter this more abstract jouissance, the other jouissance.
That's beyond our scope, because it's not that it's abstract. I mean, I kind of understand what you're trying to say, because it's jouissance and enjoyment that goes beyond that kind of usual anchor of object-subject relationship. Yes. But I don't know if abstract is what I would say in order to describe it. But I get your point. But why were you saying that in relation to this?
Because like being a single subject, you're limited to subjectivity.
Okay, yeah. But it doesn't mean the woman who enjoys in this this other way, the other Jewish songs, is not a subject. That's where things become really interesting and also complex. But it doesn't mean women are out there, they're no subject. No, they are subjects. They are definitely within this same logic of subject and object, but they have something more. That's this is Lakang again. I'm sorry.
So interesting.
Yes, yeah.
Also, I'm curious, why does he recommend that if there is a response, it needs to be in a form of, what's that word in English? I don't know. A sue or something?
Huh?
No. Wait, let me find the paragraph.
He actually says, please send no reply.
Yeah. So if he says if you decide you want to write me a
Right.
letter, please send it in care of the company in the form of a complaint.
Right.
So why does a complaint?
Because that's his department. He.
No. Like. Really?
Oh yeah. Because he. This is also a little bit ambiguous, but at least on the surface level, it's because that way the letter will come to him.
Yeah.
Because he's in the department where he's dealing with customer complaints.
Yes.
I feel like it's kind of like it's about him wanting to respect the form, also like the form of their communication. Because then if she was able to respond to him more personally, more intimately, but then would kind of like, I don't know if it's about breaking the fantasy then, but I feel like it's more about like respecting the form.
Also, I can see where the narcissism is at, because he says I cannot sleep with you because you are like an odd number.
You're an odd number?
No, he said like, hence I do not seek to sleep with you, a solitary individual.
Right.
And he also said, I am angry at the fact that, being a solitary an entity is a dreadful depressant.
Yeah, so in other words, he's basically saying, I am a solitary individual, you are a solitary individual, and in our regular sense of sexual relationship, it means that two solitary individuals come together, therefore they're less lonely. What he's aiming at is much, much better than that.
Yeah.
In a way, the letter is enough to give him what he wants, which is beyond this, it's very, very banal understanding of sexual relationship. I'm with you, so I'm not lonely anymore. That's not sexual enjoyment according to his definition. So in a way, he's saying. So that's why I'm saying those two statements may not be opposed. The second statement where he says, I don't really want to sleep with you as an individual woman, what he's saying is that what he enjoys about her has nothing to do with her as an individual person. In a way, this is a kind of articulation of that emptiness of objectività. What I am going for is this nothing that is driving me crazy, which is not the same as you as an individual person.
Wait, did he sleep with her letter?
No.
What are you saying? What are you implying?
No.
Speak up. Come on.
Oh,
Save us, Eric. Please say something.
So I guess that like I was thinking, because we were talking about rationality just now and like how that's like what defines the masculine sort of thinking, but I sort of disagreed there. But I think it's a little bit more fitting to talk about how his like his sexual enjoyment from this encounter is not from like the woman, like because he like says, oh, I don't know how you smell or how you look from this letter, but it's sexual enjoyment that comes from like the like there not being an individual in the first place. Like that was what struck me as the sexual difference in the passage anyway.
Yes,
rather
yes.
than like this rationalistic difference between man and woman. Like I can't really describe what it is for the woman, but for the man, it's
Mhm.
this like boundary that's been set for him to be able to enjoy to the maximal
Yeah.
level.
So I thought what actually we were going on what Alex was saying about this rationalistic procedural thinking, that's the limit. That's the in your to use your word, you said boundary or something,
Yeah.
right? That is the form of the boundary, right? It's like you. If you want to enjoy the excess, you have to first experience the limit. So the rationalistic thinking is the limit that you live with, and then there comes an encounter that takes you across that threshold, or it's not that the threshold is there to be crossed. It's like you experience the limit as a kind of threshold, right? So it's that so we should first of all conceptually be careful not to posit anything there kind of already. It's that's why it's an encounter. You didn't know there was such a thing, and then you kind of fall out of the regular way of existing, which is necessary. You cannot be all poetic and say we don't want rationalistic thinking. Then we're animals, nothing, So we can't dismiss that, but we have to understand that is a certain kind of constraint that is necessary, but that's not all, right?
Also, I have a question. Why does it have to be 4 kangaroos specifically? Like
4 kangaroos,
2
yeah,
female,
yeah.
1 male, one infant, right? That is very weird.
Yeah.
I wrote that as counterintuitive to our society as
Yeah,
a
that's
family.
why he says this is improbable. That's why how do
Yeah.
they get along? How do they
Yeah.
continue, right?
So he's having that idea of I don't know, immorality or bias or stereotype on how a family should be, right?
Yeah.
That they're two females. So I just wonder, why does it have to be 2 females? Kangaroos.
I was thinking about that the sexual isn't political,
Uh-huh.
that there is no actual compatibility, that men and women are compatible is more like an illusion, but like that doesn't mean you shouldn't try, but like it's still really important, and that is them sort of exploring that, going beyond the common notion of
Kangaroos?
yeah. I mean, it's a representation, I thought, not literal.
No, I think the point there is I do not know how kangaroos actually do this thing. I have no idea, right? But the point is, if you actually think about, people love to say nature so natural and humans have come to ruin it. No, the nature itself is so mad. It's you can't figure out why. Like if you think about the bees, I mean, it's the most ridiculous setup, but you know what I mean, right? So these things, so he's basically saying, so when he finishes the recording with, it's you and the 4 kangaroos who got me into this imperfection. I think this is very important, meaning the 4 kangaroos are supposed, the last line, last page.
55?
65,
very
yeah,
last. Okay,
yeah.
okay.
So the kangaroos here, I think, represent what we call nature, but nature that doesn't have any kind of natural equilibrium as we would like to posit. Nature is its own madness,
So,
right? But in a way, she or her letter comes along to kind of
Break it.
give him kind of orientation in that world of mad nature.
Yeah, I guess like that's like how I wanted to articulate like the point about the two versus the one, in which like he needs, like there has to be an anchor point, because if there's just one dot floating around the world, it's mad. But if there's an anchor point, no matter where the other goes, like there is a relativity through which you can get objectivity or rationality. But like, and I think the way he expressly says, if you're going to send me a response, you have to send it through a complaint. I think that, you know, the third party being the company, like this sort of serves that same role, in which it is a source of, it's a reference point, basically, like the sharp point on a compass. Like, and I think that's why he could get excited in the first place, and that's like what he wants, because there is a logic in the relationship of customer and like employee, and yet like the letter itself has become something that's not within that logic but objective in itself. And like there's like such a sublime objectivity that it, regardless of the objective situation, like the relationship between like customer complaint and manager, even though that exists, it managed to break out of it with its own objectivity, and it sort of forces the like objective power of the situation to fit itself, and like that's what's kind of sucked the protagonist in, and like what he's constantly striving for. I don't know, I think I'm terrible with words.
No, I think I mean it's difficult, but
Is he talking about like, so basically the company is like, if we say two things are on two sides, right, as a point, a reference point, so the company is referencing the relationship between the complaint and the receiver, right, so the woman and the man in the text, and then the other reference point, or also the other point and reference point would be his response in her letter, right? It's like the same thing. Is it how it's constructed? Or
I don't know if I understood that. I thought you were going on the importance of three, right?
Oh.
Yeah. In other words, although we focused on the fact that the sexual two is really the premise of this idea, but the two, in order to have a movement, abstraction you were calling that, it has to have a third point. But that's, I think in a way, that's how we normally experience our reality. It's always number three. It's never, when I go, when I talk to you, I'm already referencing a third point that authorizes this communication.
Like marriage in the one class that we talked about.
Yeah, I guess.
It authorizes
Yeah.
the extreme of love, the limit of love.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what I said, but yes, it's in the same neighborhood. Yes, so there is always, so the three is really the regular kind of
So
But
idea.
what is it? I thought like when we talked about the letter and like when he draws the analogy with the massacre,
Yeah.
and then it's sort of like the encounter like with the real, like isn't the point of the three like the third being, let's say, like the big other, if we were to
Right, right.
like in normative
Right,
relations,
yeah, exactly.
then isn't the point of the letter to like the real is that it escapes like this?
Exactly, that's what I'm saying.
Oh, okay.
So in a way, the three is the kind of regular reality, although we forget that all the time. We think that it's binary, but it's never binary. The third is always there to authorize. But what he's going for is that exceeds that triangle, right?
So can we also say that he's trying to get rid of three because he wants two?
Yeah, that's
So
that's yeah.
oh, so
But
then,
it's not to get rid of it. It's the nature of this encounter where the third kind of drops off. but that you cannot live in it. It's a moment that you pass through.
Yeah, so for me, the third makes things absurd, right? Because if you can literally equalize the third and the number 36 and the language. They are all like exterior things or some media thing that makes you to link your like you and the other object.
Yes,
Right?
yeah.
So that's what it makes it absurd, and he's trying to get rid of it because he hates all numbers.
But no, it's not so much that he wants. I want to say again, it's not that he wants to get rid of it.
Yeah.
This encounter kind of puts them in that space where the third falls off.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh.
But this is also what we want when we want love. Right? In a way, when we say passionate, mad love,
Yes.
Where the community around us just falls away, right? But then when you are reduced to that, is it still two individuals, or is it his penis with the letter?
Wait,
What?
the penis with the letter?
Because he's sexually excited.
Oh.
Yeah, and then he has the letter.
We were going back to
That's-
what he said
That's
about
why I
sleeping with the letter.
yeah, that's why I said sleeping the letter.
That's right.
That's my
That's
point.
how we have come full circle.
Okay,
Yes,
yeah,
that's
So that was quite brilliant,
Yeah.
Jeremy.
Yeah.
What you said about sleeping with the letter, actually.
Oh,
Yeah.
so that's the point of existentialism here. So spatial.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, how long have we been going?
It's one.
It's already one. It's
I think
probably
we
Yeah, but-
started
one-
at
like,
11:40,
11:40.
11:35, 11:40.
So we've been going for 1 hour
An
and
hour and a half, probably.
You haven't even touched on the 100%.
I think we've covered a lot, don't you think?
Yeah.
And, yeah. So and we will probably come back to this when we go on. But do we want to say something about the 100% girl?
I think it's comparatively more shallow than the Kangaroo Communiqué. So I think there's like not as much to talk about, but like again, I think the sense of fatalism or like the desire for fatalism is there again, where it's like, I have to have a reason for wanting to like this girl, but like, what if I didn't? What if it just is because she's my 100% girl? Like, the desire for predetermination is there.
Yeah.
But I think, what is it? Like it's not like he talks about like these like women that are like 75% perfect or
Yeah, yeah.
85% perfect. Like he like I guess what we talked about before, like how you were talking about like this rationality, like the limit here is the rationality of like saying like these women are like 75%, 85% compared to your 100% perfect, which obviously is like arbitrary. But the point is this limit allows him to configure 100%ness in the woman that he encounters. So like I like maybe it's not like this predetermination of like fate imposing upon us, but like I guess like this randomness, like which is fate. But like
Yeah, I mean, there's that feeling too, because like you can never get a sense of your 75% or your 65% like on something as abstract as a woman until you have your 100%. Like I think that does that make sense to your point? Yeah, like so there can only be like rationality when you have your 100%, because it like the 65-75% that's fragile. Like you can't, it's not objective. Again, it's subjective, but everything else obtains objectivity once you've found your 100%, because now you're full. Because you can look at a glass and you can't guess to like, is this like 125 milliliters? Is this like 170 milliliters? But if you know the size of a glass and it's full, then you know exactly the amount. But so like that's the difference between like 100 and like anything that's not 100, I guess.
Yeah. So is there any relationship between this passage and the materialized of both man and woman in Eastern Asia, because it was very interesting that when he mentions about the girl, he always mentioned about like her nose or her something. It's never the whole human being. It's always some part of it. And then he's like, I sound like an insurance salesman when introducing himself, which is like, I'm selling myself as a product instead of a man, right? Or a human. So I think there's like two-way direction of materializing human beings, or like trying to standardize things. It's same as giving numbers to the like you are 100% girl or boy. It's same as Alex mentioned. Like people are like water bottles, right? You just you can check it or not. It's like materializing or like quantified, yeah.
Quantifying the
Yeah.
quality. Yes, I
Yeah.
think that's what you're getting at. Yeah.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
trying to quantify everything.
Yeah.
And
I mean, in a way, once again, he's kind of bowing to the discursive requirement. You need to. So he knows. I mean, you understand that what you are saying were opposite. To, yeah, right. So that I just want to make sure that you understood. Yeah, but the point is that here, what he says is that he knows that she is the girl, but he has to tell the story to her. I mean, and even after that, the point is that he doesn't think that she will believe. Meaning, he has this conviction about her being his 100% girl, but it's almost like in an implicit way, he is calling this kind of discourse a feminine requirement. It's almost like he has to perform to the discourse, because he says what? Because she's not going to believe it. She's not going to believe it. In other words, the disbelief is given to the girl. So in a way, he knows the truth, but he has to perform this discourse in order to convince the girl who wouldn't believe the truth as he does.
So the discourse here would be referring to like his justifying that she wouldn't understand it?
Or this, just a simple formulation, you are my 100% girl. That's a formulation, and as such it's discursive, but
Which is the feminine that he prescribes?
No, he believes it, that's his experience, but he immediately says, so yeah, the top of page 70 says, maybe the simple truth would do. Good morning, you are the 100% perfect girl for me. No, she wouldn't believe it. So in other words, the top of 70, the third line, yeah. So in other words, the simple truth is like the most, the kind of purest discursive formulation that he can come up with. It's still discursive because it uses language and it has a formula, 100%, right? So it is discursive, and yet it has a certain purity to it. It's so simple. And he completely believes it. But he thinks the girl is not going to believe it. Therefore, he has to tell a story, which means he has to now really use language to come up with some kind of narrative. So in a subtle way, in an implicit way, he's saying men do all these things in order to make the girl believe them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in a way, this whole rational thinking, blah, 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 in a way, guys kind of do it because they think it's necessary to get the girl. Not because it's natural to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
That would,
wow.
my question would be, would two men do the same thing for each other?
What?
You have to tell us.
No, I mean, guys just get it. It's just
I mean, isn't that thing or like before, you know, like it's a weird thing where like if like I was like, oh, you know, I wish I married my my dude, like, you know, like
Yeah.
a straight man, or saying like, oh, if I married my guy, you know, then I would never have to do all of these things, you know, like buy flowers for her or like apologize, then we could just make up by like
It's kind of like
I recently saw a statistic in divorce rates between different types of couples, and like the divorce rate for like the success rate for like male married couples was like 70%, and the success rate for female married couples was like 30-something%. So maybe there's some actual fact behind this, like that may.
I think this is a bit risky. That's
Yeah, no, clarification, might have been completely tabloid.
Look at the camera.
Yeah, no. I'm just conveying the information I've seen.
it's like the reason I'm asking is like that would kind of like I feel like in a sense that would kind of like verify what could be natural and what is not natural to the man, because like if he's like how's he acting with another man compared to how's he acting with another woman. That's what I find so interesting about homosexuality, because you can compare and contrast how the sexes interact differently in the pursuit of love and desire and all those things.
but like
Yeah.
I'm curious what you think is like natural and like unnatural.
Homo? What?
No.
Look into the
I feel
camera and say that
like,
again.
for like let's say like we like constantly refer to like the body as like this natural, and like anything outside of that like let's say like the discourse or like language here like as unnatural. So like, I'm curious what you, because what we're constantly talking about is like even this conception of like this like natural, or like let's say like this rational man as like this natural, let's say, like even that is like, even if we affirm that a man is like rationality is associated with the man,
Like for example, like the 36 steps, like that kind of thinking, like
Yeah.
it doesn't go. Yeah, I mean, like that's very like logical, but us
but like
even.
even that is still like, isn't that like unnatural? Like we because we talk about like a whole like we interpret the body through language, so like there is no moment in which we understand the body as like this natural
Mm.
area, form, field, whatever it is. So like when we're talking about like, you know, like man on man, like, and then like gay men, like would they do the same thing as like this guy would do? Like where does the natural begin? I guess that's my question.
Ah.
Because like, I mean, we have a binary and
Yeah.
like we have man and woman in order
Yeah.
to understand,
Yeah.
or like at least like not go insane.
Or maybe natural is the wrong word. Maybe I thought. Maybe like.
No, but I'm not trying to like, you know, like
Yeah.
criticize your wording. I'm trying to understand.
Yeah.
Where-
Because I don't like. It's. Like a lot of like the struggles between two men, like this like mystery, in a sense, it's not really there, cause like you know that the object that you're attracted to is attracted to you and perceives you in the exact same way that you're perceiving them, and in a sense it also like makes the fantasy and the screen really fragile,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
you realize once you achieve your desire that there's nothing beyond that. It's kind of empty sometimes.
I see what you mean.
I mean, like on the other hand, it is like very like it is really easy. It is really chill, as you described. Like it's just like playing video games and sex, and like it's fun, but like that is not really gonna satisfy the void.
No, yeah, I mean, I said that just as like
Yeah.
like satire.
No, but like I mean, I think it's kind of true.
Huh.
It's, and like I think That was my theory in like in one of my essays that I wrote about, because like they can't really pursue this like abstract. They can't pursue this abstract way of love. So instead, like they pursue art, I think, to express their love. Also because they cannot have children, or for a long time they couldn't marry. So, but they still do love, and instead of like having a child, they dedicate like art, music, architecture, all those really grand things that like drive culture to express themselves and for their partners. And
Yeah, I mean, I'm always interested in, I don't know, because you like to say like you would die for.
yeah, I
Yeah,
do.
I mean, I'm very curious. I mean, we have more to, so we may come back to that. If you want to talk about that, we can do that later on, because today we're out of time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But, so one idea that I want to leave you with, because we have to go now, is, if it's to go by the Japanese title, 100% girl, not 100% perfect girl, right? Then if she's not 100% girl, what would be the rest? What is it? If she's not 100% girl, what's the other? You may think, so she's a boy, but it doesn't need to be that. So